The large wooden doors of courtroom 7 swung open as Karoline Leavitt walked in with her shoulders back and her head held high. At 32 years old, the blonde press secretary had already made a name for herself in Washington circles as someone who didn't back down easily. Today would test that reputation more than ever before. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised over notepads. Political staffers and curious members of the public occupied every other available seat. The air felt heavy with tension and the faint smell of lemon polish that couldn't quite mask the mustiness of the old federal building. Karoline smoothed her navy blue skirt suit and took her place beside her attorney, Nancy Collins, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s with streaks of gray in her dark brown hair. Nancy gave Karoline's hand a quick squeeze under the table. "Remember what we discussed," Nancy whispered. "No matter what happens, stay calm." Karoline nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench. The case had already dragged on for months. What had started as a routine legal matter related to her work as press secretary for a prominent political campaign had somehow morphed into something much more personal. Judge William Roberts had made that clear with his increasingly hostile questioning and rulings that seemed to target her specifically. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "All rise. The Honorable Judge William Roberts presiding." The room fell silent as Judge Roberts entered. He was a tall man with thinning white hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. At 67, he had spent nearly 3 decades on the federal bench, building a reputation for harsh sentencing and little patience for what he called modern political theatrics. He sat down and adjusted his glasses, scanning the courtroom with a frown before his gaze settled on Karoline. "Be seated," he said, his voice echoing against the wooden panels of the old courtroom. As everyone sat, Karoline noticed a slight smirk on the judge's face. Her stomach tightened. Nancy had warned her that today might not go well, but something in the judge's expression suggested it would be worse than they had prepared for. "We're here today to address the matter of repeated violations of this court's gag order," Judge Roberts began, shuffling through papers on his bench. "Ms. Leavitt, you were explicitly instructed not to discuss aspects of this case with the media, yet my clerk has compiled no fewer than 7 instances in the past month, where you appear to have done exactly that." Karoline leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor, I've carefully followed—" "I did not ask you to speak, Ms. Leavitt," Judge Roberts cut her off sharply. "Your attorney can address the court when I've finished." Nancy rose to her feet. "Your Honor, if I may, we've reviewed each of the alleged violations, and in each case, Counselor, I've made my determination after reviewing the evidence," the judge interrupted again. "The pattern is clear and deliberate." The room grew even quieter. Karoline felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just unusual, it was wrong. Judges were supposed to at least hear arguments before making rulings. In light of these violations, Judge Roberts continued, this court imposes a penalty of $50,000 to be paid within 30 days. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Nancy seemed momentarily stunned. Such a large penalty for an alleged gag order violation was virtually unheard of. Your Honor, Nancy recovered quickly. We respectfully request to present evidence that Ms. Leavitt has fully complied with the court's order. We have transcripts and recordings of all her public statements that clearly show the ruling has been made, Counselor, Judge Roberts said firmly. If you wish to appeal, you may do so through the proper channels. This matter is closed for today. He glanced at Karoline with what seemed like satisfaction. Perhaps this will serve as a reminder that this court's orders are to be taken seriously, regardless of one's political connections. With that, he struck his gavel and stood up. Court is adjourned. As Judge Roberts exited through the door behind his bench, the courtroom erupted in whispers and movement. Reporters rushed toward the doors, already typing frantically on their phones. Karoline sat perfectly still, her mind racing. Nancy leaned close to her. This is completely excessive. He didn't even let us present our evidence. We'll appeal immediately. Karoline nodded slowly, but her thoughts were already moving beyond an appeal. She had spent years in politics, learning to recognize when someone was playing a game bigger than the one on the surface. This wasn't just about enforcing a gag order. This was about silencing her completely. "Nancy," she said quietly, "I need everything we have. Every transcript, every recording, every email. And I need them tonight." Nancy looked at her client, carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Judge Roberts expected me to either break down or lash out. He wants me to make a mistake." Karoline gathered her papers with steady hands. "But he doesn't know who he's dealing with." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them on the wide stone steps. Camera lights flashed against the gray, afternoon sky. "Ms. Leavitt, will you be able to pay the $50,000 penalty?" A young male reporter shouted. "Are you going to appeal the judge's decision?" called another. "Does this ruling impact your position with the campaign?" A woman from a major network pushed her microphone forward. Karoline paused and turned toward the cameras. Nancy tensed beside her, clearly worried about what her client might say in the heat of the moment. But Karoline had spent her career crafting careful responses under pressure. "I have always had deep respect for our judicial system," she said, her voice clear and measured. "Beyond that, I have no comment at this time. Thank you." With that, she and Nancy made their way through the crowd to a waiting black SUV. Once inside with the doors closed, Karoline let out a long breath. "That was smart," Nancy said, relief evident in her voice. "But what's our next move?" Karoline pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "First, I need to talk to Ben," she said, referring to Ben Adams, her digital communications specialist. "Then I need to call Greg Sanders." "The investigative journalist?" Nancy asked, surprised. "Karoline, we need to be extremely careful here. Judge Roberts already has it out for you." Karoline looked up from her phone, a determined gleam in her eyes. "Nancy, do you know why Judge Roberts targeted me with this penalty? It's not about the case, it's about what I know." Nancy's expression shifted from concern to curiosity. "What do you mean?" "3 weeks ago I received a file from an anonymous source," Karoline said, lowering her voice despite being in the privacy of the vehicle. "It contained emails between Judge Roberts and Daniel Peterson." Nancy's eyes widened. "The campaign strategist for the opposition?" Karoline nodded. "The very same. I was verifying the information before deciding what to do with it. Roberts must have found out somehow. That's why the penalty is so large," Nancy realized. "He's trying to intimidate you." "Yes, but he made a crucial mistake," Karoline said as the SUV pulled away from the courthouse. "He did this in public, in front of dozens of witnesses and reporters. He's given me the perfect platform." As they drove through the city streets, Karoline's phone buzzed with messages of support from colleagues and friends who had already heard about the outrageous penalty. But she was focused on something else entirely. The folder of evidence hidden in her apartment and the plan forming in her mind. Judge William Roberts thought he had silenced her with his $50,000 penalty. But Karoline Leavitt was about to turn the tables in ways the judge could never have anticipated. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about exposing a corruption that went far beyond a simple gag order. By the time they reached her apartment building, Karoline had already made 3 calls and sent 7 text messages. The pieces were falling into place. Within hours, her small living room had been transformed into a war room, with Ben Adams setting up secure communications and Nancy reviewing legal strategies. "You know this won't be easy," Nancy warned her. "Judge Roberts has a lot of powerful friends." Karoline looked up from the documents spread across her coffee table and smiled for the first time that day. "So do I, Nancy. So do I." The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Karoline's apartment, casting thin stripes of light across the piles of documents, empty coffee cups, and takeout containers. It had been 3 days since Judge Roberts had hit her with the $50,000 penalty. 3 days of intense work with barely any sleep. Karoline stood in front of a large whiteboard that now covered one wall of her living room. Red and blue markers had been used to create a complex web of names, dates, and connections. At the center were 2 names: Judge William Roberts and Daniel Peterson. Ben Adams sat cross-legged on the floor, his laptop balanced on his knees. With his rumpled shirt and messy brown hair, He looked like he hadn't slept in days, because he hadn't. As Karoline's digital communications specialist, he had spent the past 72 hours combing through every email, text message, and public statement she had made in the past 6 months. "I've gone through everything 3 times, Ben said, rubbing his tired eyes. "There's absolutely nothing that violates the gag order, not even close." Nancy Collins walked in from the kitchen with fresh coffee. The attorney looked nearly as exhausted as the rest of them, but there was a fierce energy in her movements. "That's consistent with my review," Nancy said, handing mugs to Karoline and Ben. "The 7 instances the judge cited, in 5 of them you explicitly declined to comment on the specifics of the case. In the other 2, you only discussed publicly available information that wasn't covered by the gag order." Karoline nodded, taking a sip of the strong black coffee. "So we have proof I didn't violate the order, but that's just our defense. We need more if we're going to turn this around." The doorbell rang, and Karoline checked her security camera, feed on her phone before buzzing in their visitor. A minute later, John Miller entered the apartment. The digital forensics expert was in his early 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a serious expression that rarely changed. "Sorry I'm late," he said, setting his laptop bag on the table. "But I think it was worth it. I verified the metadata on those emails between Roberts and Peterson. They're authentic." The room fell silent for a moment as the significance of this sank in. "You're absolutely certain?" Nancy asked, her lawyer's caution showing. John nodded, confidently. "The digital signatures match, the server information checks out, and I've verified the communication paths. Unless someone has access to both men's accounts and extraordinary technical skills, these are real." Karoline walked over to the table where printouts of the emails were spread out. The messages weren't explicitly illegal, but they showed a clear bias and coordination that no federal judge should ever engage in. Judge Roberts had been communicating regularly with Daniel Peterson, a key political operative working against Karoline's boss in the upcoming election. "Look at the timing," Karoline said, pointing to dates marked in yellow highlighter. 3 days after this email where Peterson complains about my press strategy, Roberts issued the first gag order. And here, the day after Peterson mentions needing to contain the damage from Leavitt's messaging, Roberts expanded the gag order's scope. Ben whistled softly. "That's not subtle." "No, it's not," Nancy agreed. "But we need to be very careful how we use this. Judges have a lot of protection, and if we mishandle this, it could backfire badly." Karoline picked up one of the emails and read aloud. "She needs to be neutralized before the September push. Her messaging is too effective." That was Peterson, writing to Roberts just last week. She put the paper down. 3 days later, I get hit with a $50,000 penalty that would financially devastate most people." John opened his laptop. "There's more. I found something interesting when I was verifying the email chains." He pulled up a document and turned the screen so everyone could see it. "This is a bank statement for a shell company called Riverside Consulting. Judge Roberts is the beneficial owner, hidden behind 2 layers of LLCs. And look who paid them $80,000 last year." On the screen was a transaction record showing a payment from another company, with Daniel Peterson's name listed as the authorizing signatory. "This goes beyond bias," Nancy said quietly. "This is potential criminal conduct." Karoline walked back to the whiteboard and added this new information to their growing diagram. "So we have the evidence showing I never violated the gag order. We have the emails showing improper communication between Roberts and Peterson. And now we have financial connections that suggest possible bribery. The question is how to use it," Ben said. Karoline turned to face the group, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as determination lit up her eyes. "If I just release this to the media, Roberts will claim it's fabricated. He'll use his position to discredit me, and it becomes a he said, she said situation. Not to mention potential legal issues with how some of this information was obtained," Nancy added cautiously. "Right," Karoline agreed. "So we need to be smarter. We need to get Roberts to reveal himself." Ben leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" "A trap," Karoline said simply. "One that gives him a chance to dig his own grave deeper." She walked to the window and looked out at the city for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she turned back, she had the beginnings of a plan. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to hold a press conference, but I won't mention Roberts or the case directly. Instead, I'm going to announce the creation of a new organization focused on judicial transparency. Nancy raised an eyebrow. That's going to get his attention? Exactly, Karoline continued. Second, Ben will start a carefully controlled leak suggesting that I have evidence of judicial misconduct but without specifics, just enough to make Roberts nervous. Ben nodded, already typing notes on his laptop. Third, John will create a secure backup of all our evidence and share it with trusted third parties, including Greg Sanders at the National Observer. Insurance, John said approvingly. Meanwhile, Karoline continued, Nancy will prepare 2 legal filings. One is a standard appeal of the penalty, focusing solely on the fact that I never violated the gag order. The second, which will hold in reserve, is a formal complaint about Robert's misconduct, complete with all our evidence. Nancy was already making notes. We'll need to be extremely precise with the second filing. The Judicial Review Board doesn't take kindly to frivolous complaints against judges. It won't be frivolous, Karoline assured her, and we'll only file it if necessary. She walked back to the whiteboard and drew a circle around their plan. Roberts expects me to either pay the penalty quietly or file a standard appeal that he and his friends can easily dismiss. He doesn't expect a counterattack. And he certainly doesn't know that we have these emails or the financial records. For the first time in days, the mood in the room lifted slightly. They had a plan. A risky one, but a plan nonetheless. There's one more thing, Karoline said, picking up her phone. We need public opinion on our side. She scrolled through her contacts and stopped at a name. And I know just the person to help with that. She pressed call and put the phone on speaker. Karoline, a woman's voice answered. I've been trying to reach you since I heard about that ridiculous penalty. Hey Lisa, Karoline replied. I'm sorry I've been off the grid, but I'm back now, and I could use your help. How would you feel about an exclusive interview? Lisa Carter, host of one of the most popular political podcasts in the country, didn't hesitate. Name the time and place. My listeners would love to hear your side of this story. As Karoline ended the call, she looked around at her small but dedicated team. The next 48 hours are critical. Roberts thinks he's silenced me with that penalty. He's about to discover how wrong he is. Ben raised his coffee mug in a mock toast to turning the tables. The others joined in, and for a brief moment, exhaustion gave way to determination. The battle was just beginning. But for the first time since walking out of that courtroom, Karoline felt like she had the upper hand. Outside, the city was waking up to a new day, unaware of the storm that was about to break. In his large house, across town, Judge William Roberts slept soundly, confident in his power and position. That peace wouldn't last much longer. The conference room at the Westfield Hotel buzzed with activity as journalists set up cameras and tested microphones. Karoline stood just outside the door, watching through a small window as the room filled with reporters from every major news outlet in the country. Her press conference was scheduled to begin in exactly 15 minutes. Nervous? Nancy asked, appearing beside her with a folder of documents. Karoline smoothed her red blazer and adjusted her simple pearl necklace. Not nervous, just focused. Ben approached them, scrolling through his phone. Social media is already going crazy. Karoline vs. Roberts is trending. Everyone's expecting you to blast the judge. Which is exactly what we want them to think, Karoline replied. She took a deep breath and checked her reflection one last time in a nearby mirror. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she had chosen makeup that made her look both serious and approachable. Image mattered in politics, and today's appearance needed to strike the perfect balance. Remember, Nancy cautioned, not one word about the specific case or the gag order. We need to be absolutely certain we don't give Roberts any ammunition. Karoline nodded. Trust me, I know exactly what I'm doing. At precisely 10 o'clock, Karoline walked into the conference room and took her place behind the podium. Camera, flashes exploded around her, and the room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. Good morning, she began, her voice steady and clear. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I have a brief statement to make, and then I'll take a few questions. She paused, making eye contact with several reporters before continuing. Today, I am announcing the formation of the American Judicial Transparency Project, a nonpartisan initiative dedicated to promoting accountability and fairness in our court system. This wasn't what the journalists had expected. There was a brief murmur of confusion before they quieted down again. Our justice system is the foundation of our democracy, Karoline continued. When that system functions properly, it protects all citizens equally. But when it fails, when it becomes a tool for personal vendettas or political gain, it threatens the very principles our nation was built upon. She didn't mention Judge Roberts or her case, but everyone in the room knew exactly what she was referring to. The beauty of her approach was its deniability. She was speaking in general terms that could apply to many situations. The American Judicial Transparency Project will work to shine a light on instances where judicial power is misused. We will provide resources for those who have been unfairly targeted by the system, and we will advocate for reforms that ensure no judge is above scrutiny or accountability. Karoline paused again, letting her words sink in before delivering the key part of her message. I believe deeply in the rule of law. I respect our judicial institutions, but respect does not mean blind obedience, especially when those institutions fail to uphold their own standards of fairness and impartiality. At his chambers across town, Judge William Roberts watched the press conference on his computer screen, his face growing increasingly red with anger. His clerk, Susan Wright, stood nervously in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. She's clearly talking about me, Roberts sputtered, pointing at the screen. This is a blatant attempt to undermine my authority. Susan hesitated before speaking. Sir, she hasn't actually mentioned you or the case. She's being very careful. Roberts glared at his clerk. Don't be naive, Susan. Everyone knows what she's doing. Get me Daniel Peterson on the phone, now. Back at the press conference, Karoline had moved on to the question and answer portion. Ms. Leavitt, a reporter from the Washington Post, called out. Is this new organization a direct response to Judge Roberts' $50,000 penalty against you? Karoline smiled slightly. The American Judicial Transparency Project has been in development for some time. I believe the timing is sometimes providential. Beyond that, I won't comment on any specific legal matters. Another reporter tried a different angle. Do you plan to pay the penalty or will you appeal? My legal team is handling all aspects of that matter, Karoline replied smoothly. What I can tell you is that I have always followed the letter and spirit of all court orders, and I will continue to do so. A journalist from a conservative news network stood up. Ms. Leavitt, there are rumors that you have evidence of judicial misconduct. Can you confirm or deny these reports? This was the question Karoline had been waiting for, the one Ben had arranged through careful leaks to friendly sources. She paused, letting the tension build before answering. I believe in using proper channels for addressing any concerns about our judicial system. The American Judicial Transparency Project will work within existing legal frameworks to ensure that evidence of misconduct, wherever it exists, is properly documented and presented to the appropriate authorities. The room erupted with follow-up questions, but Karoline raised her hand. I've said all I can say at this time. Thank you for coming. With that, she stepped away from the podium and exited the room, leaving the press corps buzzing with speculation. Nancy and Ben followed her to a private room they had reserved at the hotel. That was perfect, Ben said, checking social media on his tablet. You gave them just enough to keep the story alive without crossing any lines. Nancy nodded in agreement. Roberts can't touch you for anything you said today, but he'll be furious. Good, Karoline said, taking off her blazer and sitting down. The angrier he gets, the more likely he is to make a mistake. Her phone buzzed with a text from John Miller. Package delivered to Sanders, he's reviewing now. Greg Sanders, the investigative journalist, had received their evidence package and was carefully going through it. If Roberts made any move against Karoline, Sanders was ready to publish everything. Across town, Daniel Peterson paced in Judge Roberts' chambers. "You need to shut this down immediately," Peterson hissed. "She's boxing us in." Roberts slammed his hand on his desk. "Don't you think I know that? But I have to be careful. If I hit her with another penalty now, it will look like retaliation. It is retaliation," Peterson snapped. "But necessary retaliation. She's becoming a martyr and we can't have that. Not with the election just months away." Roberts sat heavily in his leather chair. "I could schedule an emergency hearing, claim she violated the gag order again with this press conference." Peterson shook his head. "She didn't mention the case once. I watched the whole thing. She was too careful for that." "Then what do you suggest?" Roberts demanded. Peterson thought for a moment. "What about her attorney? Nancy Collins has been a thorn in our side for years. Find something on her, and you can disqualify her from representing Leavitt." A slow smile spread across Roberts's face. "Actually, there might be something there. Collins represented a client last year in a case with some similarities to this one. I could claim it's a conflict of interest." Neither man noticed Susan, the clerk, standing just outside the open door, her phone in her hand, the voice memo app recording everything they said. Back at the hotel, Karoline's phone rang. It was Lisa Carter, the podcast host. "That was quite a performance," Lisa said. "Ready for our interview tomorrow?" "Absolutely," Karoline replied. "But remember, we need to focus on the broader issues of judicial accountability, not just my situation." "Of course," Lisa agreed. "Though I have to ask, do you really have evidence against Roberts, or is that just a rumor?" Karoline smiled, even though Lisa couldn't see her. "Let's just say that truth has a way of coming to light, especially when powerful people think they're above the law." As she ended the call, Nancy entered the room with a concerned expression. "We just got word from the courthouse. Roberts has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. He's claiming there's a potential conflict of interest with me as your attorney." Ben looked up from his tablet. "That was fast. He's definitely rattled." Instead of looking worried, Karoline smiled. "Good. That means phase 2 of our plan is working perfectly. He's doing exactly what we predicted." Nancy raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is phase 2? "Letting Judge Roberts think he's regaining control," Karoline explained, "while he actually digs himself deeper into a hole of his own making." The three of them gathered around the hotel room table, preparing for their next move in a chess game where $50,000 was just the opening gambit. The next morning arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle that matched the tense mood. Karoline and Nancy arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early for the emergency hearing. They sat in Nancy's car in the parking garage, reviewing their strategy one last time. "He's going to try to remove me as your attorney," Nancy said, flipping through her legal notes. "His claim about conflict of interest is paper thin, but he's the judge. He can make rulings that take months to overturn on appeal." Karoline nodded, watching raindrops race down the car window. "Let him. We have a backup plan." As they prepared to exit the car, Karoline's phone buzzed with a text from Ben. "Sanders just published. Check your email." She quickly opened her email to find a link to Greg Sanders' new article in the National Observer. The headline read, "Judicial Overreach, the Weaponization of Gag Orders and Financial Penalties." The article didn't directly accuse Judge Roberts of wrongdoing, but it detailed a troubling pattern in his recent cases. Sanders had interviewed 3 other individuals who had faced unusually harsh penalties from Roberts after opposing political allies of Daniel Peterson. The article also raised questions about the judge's financial interests, stopping just short of revealing the specific evidence Karoline's team had uncovered. "Perfect timing," Karoline said, showing Nancy the article. "This will be all over social media before we even enter the courtroom." They made their way through security and up to courtroom 7. Unlike the previous hearing, today the hallway was packed with reporters and spectators. Word had spread quickly about the emergency hearing. Inside the courtroom, Karoline noticed Susan, Judge Roberts' clerk, sitting at her usual spot, but looking unusually nervous. Their eyes met briefly, and Susan gave an almost imperceptible nod, before looking down at her papers. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Roberts entered. His face was a mask of judicial sternness, but Karoline could see the tension around his eyes and mouth. He was under pressure. "We're here today on my motion regarding a potential conflict of interest," Roberts began without preamble. "It has come to the court's attention that Ms. Collins previously represented clients in matters that bear substantial similarities to aspects of this case." Nancy stood, calm and professional. "Your Honor, I've reviewed the cases you referenced in your motion. While there are superficial similarities, there is no actual conflict as defined by the Bar Association's ethical guidelines." Roberts waved his hand dismissively. "I disagree, Counselor. The parallels are significant enough to raise serious concerns about your ability to maintain objectivity." He shuffled through some papers on his bench. "Furthermore, I've discovered that you once made public statements critical of this court's approach to First Amendment issues. This suggests a bias that may compromise your representation." Karoline watched as murmurs spread through the courtroom. Roberts was overreaching, and everyone knew it. Lawyers criticized courts all the time. It was part of legal discourse. Nancy remained composed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, attorneys regularly engage in scholarly criticism of legal approaches without it constituting bias. The Bar Association explicitly protects such discourse as vital to the evolution of legal thought." Roberts' face reddened slightly. "Nevertheless, I find that the combination of these factors creates an untenable situation. Ms. Collins, you are hereby disqualified from representing Ms. Leavitt in this matter." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Even those who had expected this outcome were shocked by the bluntness of Roberts's move. Nancy gathered her papers calmly. "I will, of course, respect the court's ruling, Your Honor. However, I must note for the record that we believe this decision is without proper legal foundation and will be appealing immediately." Roberts nodded curtly. "So noted. Ms. Leavitt, you will have 14 days to secure new counsel. Until then, all other aspects of this case are stayed, including the deadline for payment of your penalty." As Nancy prepared to leave the counsel table, Karoline stood. "Your Honor, if I may address the court?" Roberts looked surprised but nodded. "Briefly, Ms. Leavitt." Karoline spoke clearly, her voice carrying throughout the courtroom. "I already have alternate counsel prepared to step in, Your Honor. Mr. Alan Martinez is present in the courtroom today and is ready to take over my representation immediately." From the gallery, a distinguished man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and an impeccable gray suit stood up. Alan Martinez was a legal legend, a former state Supreme Court justice who now only took cases that interested him personally. Roberts couldn't hide his shock. "Mr. Martinez, you're representing Ms. Leavitt?" Martinez walked forward to the counsel table. "I am, Your Honor. My paperwork is in order, and I'm prepared to continue without delay." Roberts seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Alan Martinez had a spotless reputation and was respected across the political spectrum. Trying to disqualify him would be nearly impossible. "Very well," Roberts finally said, his voice tight. "Mr. Martinez, you may proceed as counsel of record. We'll continue with the normal schedule of this case." As Nancy left the courtroom, she gave Karoline's shoulder a quick squeeze. This had been part of their strategy all along, letting Roberts think he had won a victory by removing Nancy, only to face the much more formidable Martinez. Martinez addressed the court with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. "Your Honor, as my first action as Ms. Leavitt's counsel, I'd like to file this motion for reconsideration of the $50,000 penalty." He handed a thick document to the bailiff, who brought it to Judge Roberts. As Roberts began to read, his face paled slightly. Martinez had included a detailed analysis proving that Karoline had never violated the gag order, supported by transcripts, video evidence, and legal precedents that directly contradicted Roberts's ruling. "I'll need time to review this," Roberts said, closing the folder. "Of course, Your Honor," Martinez replied. "And while you do, I'd like to draw the court's attention to a related matter. I've also filed a motion for you to recuse yourself from this case." The courtroom fell completely silent. Asking a judge to remove himself was a bold move that attorneys rarely made. Robert's knuckles whitened as he gripped the bench. "On what grounds?" Martinez's voice remained respectful but firm. The appearance of impropriety, Your Honor. My motion details communications and financial connections that, if made public, could raise significant questions about impartiality in this case. It was a masterful move. Martinez hadn't explicitly mentioned the emails or the money trail connecting Roberts to Peterson, but he had made it clear that he knew about them. The ball was now in Roberts' court. He could either dig in and risk exposure, or he could back down. I'll review both motions and rule within 3 days, Roberts said, his voice strained. With that, he abruptly adjourned the hearing and left the courtroom. Outside, reporters swarmed around Karoline and Martinez. Ms. Leavitt, did you anticipate Judge Roberts removing your attorney? A reporter called out. Karoline smiled politely. In legal matters, it's always wise to be prepared for all possibilities. Another reporter pushed forward. Mr. Martinez, your motion mentioned communications and financial connections. Can you elaborate? Martinez shook his head. The documents speak for themselves. We believe in using proper legal channels before trying cases in the media. As they made their way through the crowd, Karoline's phone buzzed with a message from Ben. Lisa's podcast with you just dropped. It's already breaking download records. The interview Karoline had recorded with Lisa Carter the previous evening was now live, perfectly timed to coincide with the aftermath of the hearing. In it, Karoline spoke eloquently about the broader issues of judicial accountability without ever directly accusing Roberts of wrongdoing. By the time Karoline and Martinez reached their car, the story had exploded across all media platforms. Judge Roberts' recuse was trending nationally, and legal experts were appearing on news programs to discuss the unusual developments in the case. In his chambers, Judge William Roberts sat alone, staring at the recusal motion on his desk. His phone had been ringing nonstop, but he wasn't answering. He had underestimated Karoline Leavitt at every turn, and now he was cornered. The $50,000 penalty that was meant to silence her had instead given her a platform, and she had used it masterfully. The following 3 days seemed to last forever. Karoline tried to maintain her normal work routine, but it was nearly impossible with her phone constantly buzzing with updates. The story had grown beyond her case and touched a nerve in the national conversation about judicial accountability. On the morning of the third day, Karoline sat in her kitchen with Ben and John drinking coffee and monitoring news coverage. Martinez had called an hour earlier to say he had received notice of an emergency session in Judge Roberts' courtroom scheduled for 10 o'clock. What do you think it means? Ben asked, refreshing his news feeds for the 100th time that morning. Karoline set down her mug. Either he's doubling down, or he's found a way out. John looked up from his laptop. There's another possibility. My contact at the courthouse says the chief judge of the district asked for a meeting with Roberts yesterday afternoon. They were behind closed doors for over 2 hours. This was new information. The chief judge getting involved suggested the situation had escalated beyond Roberts' control. That changes things, Karoline said thoughtfully. The chief judge would be concerned about the reputation of the entire court system, not just Roberts. Her phone rang. It was Nancy. You need to turn on Channel 7 right now, Nancy said without preamble. Ben grabbed the remote and switched on the television. A reporter stood outside the courthouse with a breaking news banner across the bottom of the screen. Sources within the courthouse have confirmed that the FBI visited Judge William Roberts' chambers yesterday evening, the reporter was saying. While the nature of their visit remains unclear, it comes amid growing questions about the judge's handling of several high-profile cases and allegations of improper communications with political operatives. The three of them stared at the screen. In shock. Did you know about this? Ben asked John, who shook his head. This wasn't us, John said. We shared our evidence with Sanders and filed it with Martinez's motions, but we never went to the FBI. Karoline's mind raced. Susan, she said suddenly. It had to be Susan, the clerk. She must have gone to the authorities on her own. Reporter continued. Judge Roberts is scheduled to make a statement at 10 o'clock this morning. We'll bring you that live when it happens. Karoline checked her watch. They had less than an hour. Let's go, she said, grabbing her coat. I want to be there in person. The scene at the courthouse was chaotic. Journalists and camera crews packed the steps, while curious onlookers gathered behind hastily erected barriers. Karoline, Ben, and John managed to make their way inside, where they met Martinez in the lobby. "What's happening?" Karoline asked her attorney. Martinez adjusted his tie. "I received a call from the chief judge 30 minutes ago. Roberts is recusing himself from your case, but there's more. He's taking an indefinite leave of absence from the bench." Before Karoline could respond, Nancy pushed through the crowd to join them. "You've all seen the news?" she asked, slightly out of breath. "The FBI involvement wasn't just about our case. They've apparently been investigating Roberts for months regarding a series of land deals connected to a development company owned by Daniel Peterson." Karoline finished the sentence. The pieces were falling into place. The group made their way to courtroom 7, which was already filled beyond capacity. Extra chairs had been brought in, but many people still stood along the walls. Karoline spotted Susan sitting rigidly at her usual place, her face pale but composed. At exactly 10 o'clock, a side door opened and Judge Roberts entered, but not from his usual entrance behind the bench. Instead, he walked in like any other civilian, accompanied by an older man Karoline recognized as Stephen Walsh, one of the city's top defense attorneys. The chief judge, Eleanor Simmons, took the bench instead, a tall woman in her 60s with short gray hair and piercing eyes. Judge Simmons was known for her no-nonsense approach and impeccable ethical standards. "These are unusual circumstances," Judge Simmons began, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the courtroom. "Judge William Roberts has asked to make a statement regarding case number 2025 CV 7841 and other matters. Judge Roberts, you may proceed." Roberts stepped forward, looking smaller somehow without his robes and his elevated bench. His face was drawn, and his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. "I am recusing myself from the case of United States v. Leavitt, effective immediately," he read, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Furthermore, I am taking an indefinite leave of absence from my judicial duties while I address certain personal and professional matters." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "The $50,000 penalty imposed on Ms. Leavitt is hereby vacated, and all restrictions related to the previously issued gag order are lifted." A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. Karoline felt Nancy squeeze her arm in silent. "Congratulations," Roberts continued, now visibly struggling to maintain his composure. "I want to make it clear that my decision today is voluntary and does not constitute an admission of any wrongdoing or impropriety. I have served on the federal bench for 28 years and have always strived to uphold the highest standards of judicial conduct," Judge Simmons interjected. "Thank you, Judge Roberts. This court accepts your recusal and will reassign the Leavitt case accordingly." She looked around the packed courtroom. "In the interest of transparency, I should inform those present that the Judicial Council has opened a formal inquiry into certain matters related to Judge Roberts' conduct. As this is an ongoing process, neither the court nor Judge Roberts will be taking questions at this time." With that, she struck her gavel once and the formal proceedings were over. Roberts was quickly ushered out a side door by his attorney, avoiding the press. The courtroom erupted in conversation as reporters rushed to file their stories. Karoline sat still for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had won, not just for herself, but for the principle she had been fighting for. Martinez leaned over. "Congratulations. Not many people take on a federal judge and come out on top." Karoline smiled. "I had a good team." Outside the courthouse, Karoline faced a wall of cameras and microphones. Ben had prepared a statement for her, but as she looked at the eager faces of the reporters, she decided to speak from the heart instead. "Today isn't about victory or defeat," she began. "It's about accountability. Our justice system works only when everyone, from the highest judge to the average citizen, is held to the same standards." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "The $50,000 penalty that was imposed on me was never really about money. It was about power and the attempt to silence legitimate speech. That attempt failed, because in America, the truth still matters." A reporter called out, "Ms. Leavitt, do you think Judge Roberts should resign permanently?" Karoline shook her head. That's not for me to say. There are proper processes for reviewing judicial conduct, and I trust those processes will work as they should. Another reporter shouted. What about your American Judicial Transparency Project? Will you still pursue that? Absolutely, Karoline replied with conviction. What happened in my case isn't unique. Across the country, there are people who face similar situations but don't have the resources or platform to fight back. The project will help give them a voice. As the questions continued, Karoline noticed Susan, the clerk, standing at the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met, and Susan gave a small nod before turning to walk away. No words were needed. They both understood the role she had played. Later that evening, Karoline's team gathered at her apartment to celebrate. The mood was jubilant, but also reflective. So what happens now? Ben asked, raising his glass in a tart. Karoline smiled. Now the real work begins. What happened with Roberts was just a symptom of a larger problem. The American Judicial Transparency Project is going to address the cause. Nancy raised her glass. To turning the tables. And to truth, Karoline added, which eventually finds its way into the light. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the night sky. In a few days, another news cycle would begin, and the media would move on to other stories. But something had changed. A powerful message had been sent. No one, not even a federal judge, was above accountability. And sometimes when someone tries to silence you with a $50,000 penalty, the best response is to turn the tables and let justice speak even louder.